Als het goed is moet het 20 minuten duren. Want ik heb niet overschreden, geloof ik.
Oké, nee, dan kunnen we nu beginnen. Dus nou ja, u mag zich tot het publiek richten.
Ja. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this conference. To start, I want to make some remarks to explain the origins and the objectives of this conference. In the summer of 2018, I visited a conference of the European Association for the History of Nursing at the School of Health at the Zurich Academy of Applied Sciences in Winterthur, Switzerland. Here, the association asked me to organize a conference in the Netherlands in 2021, if possible, about a theme that was related to mental health nursing. This conference should also lead to a thematic edition of the Digital European Journal for Nursing History and Ethics. I replied I would do so when I was permitted to choose a theme that had relevance for general nursing as well. This because nearing the end of my career as a mental health nurse, after having written a thorough PhD thesis about the development of mental health nursing in the Netherlands, I hoped to bridge the still substantial gap between the fields of general and mental health. As a potential theme to build this bridge, I suggested the acute care for patients after self-harm and/or suicide attempt, the support for suicidal patients and their families, as well as the support for bereaved family members after suicide. The present members applauded this suggestion. In April 2019, Karen Nolte from the association and the journal visited me in Utrecht, and we set dates for May 2021. Later, the COVID pandemic forced us to postpone to 2022. Soon after Karen's visit, I met the newly appointed extraordinary professor in medical history Manon Perry of the Free University in Amsterdam, who had recently been installed as member of the board of the Stichting Zuster van Nijde, a Dutch fund for historical research in nursing. Because Perry had never avoided any theme with a taboo-like character, I asked her support in organizing and financing this conference, and she agreed without any hesitation. After she had been promised a substantial amount of money for the conference from Stichting Zuster van Nijde in April 2020, I asked Professor Anneloes van Sta from the University of Applied Sciences in Rotterdam for additional funding. This because I knew Van Sta is especially interested in the problems of youngsters with a chronic disease, and this group seemed potentially at risk, while they were the ones who suffered most because of the pandemic. Besides, Van Sta had just been rewarded a large sum of money for her outstanding work in connecting academic education with practice-oriented research in nursing. Anneloes joined us with money from the so-called Vital Delta. She also connected me with Jeannette Been-Damen, a Rotterdam-based postdoc in mental health nursing who was planning a qualitative research project into the attitude of nurses in general hospitals toward psychiatric patients. At this point in time, I was already acquainted with the network of general nurses that Marja Fuchs of 113 Suicide Prevention was building. And I also knew that I would start as a researcher and lecturer at the University of Applied Sciences in Leiden in August 2019. In short, the connection between Jeannette Been-Damen, Marja Fuchs and me resulted in a shared qualitative research project on the attitude and needs of general nurses who are confronted with suicidal patients. Tomorrow, I will present some first rough data of this project. At the end of November 2020, the Dutch Parliament unanimously accepted a motion that lifted suicide prevention into a theme about which all professionals in healthcare must be educated. This was the result of pressure by Professor Dr. Ad Kerkhoff, a psychologist who used his whole career in resisting the societal indifference towards more than 1,500 victims of suicide every year in the Netherlands, and the Yvonne van de Ven Foundation of bereaved family members. As is well known, the latter often utter serious complaints about the way their lost family member and they themselves are treated by healthcare professionals. All in all, by December 2020, Perry and I could identify two interesting objectives for the conference of the European Association. First, it could awaken interest in medical historians to share results of their research on suicide in the past, but also stimulate these historians to start research into the multiple and complex duties of 20th century health professionals with regard to suicidal patients and their families. Secondly, it could serve as a starting point to meet the legitimate wish of the bereaved for adequate teaching material on the support for patients after suicide attempt, the guidance of suicidal patients, and suicide prevention in the existing regular education programs for nurses and nurse practitioners. With regard to the latter, the conference could also open discussion on the scope of suicide prevention programs. What material should such programs contain? With these objectives in mind, the conference program is shaped. And I thank all mentioned partners for their help, but also Rob Bakker, Director of the Special Dutch Academy for Nurse Practitioners in Mental Health, GGZ-VS. And of course, I thank Elred Brinkman for chairing this session and for the various sorts of help she has offered me from the Faculty of Health at the University of Applied Sciences in Leiden. Last but not least, I thank my management assistant Manon van Gemerden, for whom this was the first international conference she supported. Together, we experienced a rather stressful period after discovering that the members of the European Association who had applauded the theme in 2018 did not register. Most likely, digital life during the corona pandemic has changed humanity. Why am I interested in suicide and suicide prevention? I started my work as a nurse in 1976 on the Department of Internal Medicine of a general hospital. Here I witnessed how patients who were hospitalized because of attempted suicide were forced to eat with plastic forks and knives without receiving any psychological support. The plastic cutlery seemed to stigmatize them because their fellow patients most likely considered them to be psychiatric cases. This gave me feelings of vicarious shame. In 1980, I worked on a closed ward for 18 adults in mental crisis in a psychiatric hospital. During a whole year, I was involved in the nursing care for a young woman who had already lived for half a year in complete isolation because she harmed herself on a daily basis and once in a while also attacked other persons, patients and personnel alike. During some months, the ward housed a female fellow patient who competed with her in this behavior. I wasn't taught how to prevent this behavior, other than by taking restrictive measures, robbing them of ever more freedoms, using isolation the cell, and the like. But during my encounters with them, I tried to be as respectful and empathic as possible. For instance, I bought the woman who was compelled to spend her days in an isolation cell naked a dressing gown, in order not to make her feel inferior to the nurse who was expected to accompany her. At that time, given the oppressive climate, this gesture demanded some courageousness. In 1985, the Leiden-based psychologist Ad Kerkhoff published his thesis about the treatment of suicidal patients in general hospitals and mental health institutions. Although I recognized some of my own nursing experiences in this book, it shocked me to read it. Between 1982 and 1985, Kerkhoff had interviewed 125 staff members from 36 general hospitals about the procedures for patients who had entered the hospital after suicide attempt. After this, he had counted how many suicide attempters had been hospitalized in the Academic Hospital of Leiden during 1983. These were 173 persons. And he had interviewed 120 of these former patients about their experiences. When it turned out that only 45 of these former patients had been transferred to a psychiatric hospital, he traced 40 of them to interview them about the way they had been received there. His conclusions were devastating. For instance, procedures for suicide attempters were either non-existent in general hospitals or not familiar to the professionals. Secondly, only 20 of the 120 interviewed Leiden suicide attempters had been referred to an ambulant mental health center, and these patients hadn't felt content about the few encounters with a therapist that had spoken with them a few times. Only 12 of the 40 interviewed hospitalized patients in psychiatry had experienced an immediate intake by a psychiatrist who was, on that occasion, accompanied by mental health nurses. The other 28 patients had merely seen nurses. Kerkhoff considered this absence of psychiatrists alarming. But also the way the nurses had received the 28 patients had not created trust in these patients. Let me tell you why. 10 patients had been sent to bed right away. 5 patients had been isolated, though 2 of them suffered from hallucinations. 4 patients had been offered an introductory tour through the ward, and 9 patients had not received any special attention whatsoever. On the other hand, the nurses had confronted them with restrictive measures in order to prevent new suicide attempts, such as not giving them permission to leave the ward or the hospital grounds 16 times, isolating them in a cell 13 times, not giving permission for weekend leave 9 times, guiding them continuously 9 times, controlling their medication intake 6 times, obliging them to hand in medication, razors or shoelaces 6 times, and confronted them with anti-suicide contracts 2 times. Kerkhoff concluded that, according to 43 of the 40 patients, this is 17 persons, the nurses hadn't spent enough time and energy in cozy small talk with the patients to build a trustworthy relationship. On top of that, their restrictive measures had made the patients more reluctant to talk with nurses about their suicidal ideations. They merely feared new oppression. The nurses, according to the patients, had more than once felt afraid they would stimulate suicide if they talked with the patients about suicidal ideations. And thus, Kerkhoff concluded, the patients were unable to talk with anyone about their suicidal ideations or plans. This lack of openness he considered dangerous, and he concluded that patients expected nothing else from nurses than cozy small talk, and certainly not serious psychological conversations or emotional support. This conclusion I considered, even though partly true, unacceptable. For this would mean that based on interviews with 17 interviewed suicide attempters of the academic hospital in Leiden in 1983, all nursing staff members belonging to the largest profession in the field of mental health, persons who are charged with the responsibility to spend most of their time with the patients because of a 24-hour schedule, were excluded from the possibility to have any function within the therapeutic workforce with regard to suicide. In 2012, I presented my own PhD thesis about the history of mental health nursing in the Netherlands between 1830 and 1980. For this thesis, I had used 4 research methods to be able to say something about 3 facets in particular. I had used primary sources and in diverse archives, primary and secondary literature, and a survey among 100 former psychiatric nurses, and oral history by additional interviewing some 20 former psychiatric nurses at length. I wanted to say something about 3 facets in particular: the training of nurses in psychiatry, the job market for psychiatric nurses, and the customs and manners in their everyday professional practice. And with regard to the latter, one of the 3 professional themes selected here was nurses' reactions to suicide and suicide attempts by mental patients. My conclusion was partly in line with that of Kerkhoff, for also I concluded that with regard to suicide and suicide attempters, psychiatrists had had very few tasks during the 20th century. The psychiatrist merely had to warn the nurses when they felt a patient was in danger to commit suicide, to bring this patient an incidental visit of a few minutes, to confirm death after suicide and send a message to the Dutch Central Desk of Statistics, to write an evaluative report about the treatment they had given the patient involved, and, from 1984 onwards, to report the suicide to the inspectorate. The nurses, on the other hand, as you see, had a very large responsibility because they had multiple and complex tasks to perform, and as I had experienced myself, these tasks were also somewhat contradictory. For the nurses were supposed to nurse and care for these patients, to also guard and control the patients in order to prevent suicide, and they surely needed eyes everywhere to be able to fulfill this order. They had to calm them down and to estimate the seriousness of the suicidal ideations, to monitor the effects of their medication, to listen to and understand them, to give back freedoms as much as possible, to protect and console the patients. Whenever a patient unexpectedly escaped, they had to search for him or her, and when they found the wounded person, they had to ventilate and resuscitate him or her, after very cruel suicide, identify the body and search for all body parts. Until well after World War II, nurses also had to lay off the dead body and sometimes even bury it. Afterwards, they reported what had happened and returned all personal belongings to the patient to his or her family. In doing this, they also tried to console the bereaved. It may be clear that performing all these tasks requires attentiveness as well as emotional intelligence. I am convinced that many mental health nurses with a substantial career in psychiatry possessed these qualities. Otherwise, they would have left earlier or they would have been forced to quit their job. But I must surely admit their education could and should have prepared them better, because charging people with these complex and contradictory tasks without supporting them with the right education is not correct. The parliamentary motion for which Kerkhoff fought in 2020 proves that he has, during the 35 years after his PhD thesis, witnessed too little progress in the way suicide attempters are supported by mental health professionals, but also that he has gained new insights about the potential worth of using also mental health nurses in the prevention of suicide as well. I expect that Bureau 113, Suicide Prevention, supports this policy, and I hope this conference will afford us with some extra input for the education to be developed. To conclude my lecture, I have only one last picture to show. Here you see Jannie. Oh. Dat lukt. Oh. Oh, wat gek. Hij heeft doorgescrollt, maar ik moet even naar de laatste. Nee, nog... heel even terug. Oh, dan gaat hij weer. Nou, ik ga hem nog even naar de laatste doen. Sorry hoor, hij doet het weer. Hij staat nu op slot. Krijgt er geen de laatste slide moet ik hebben. We kunnen misschien beter naar beneden gaan. De allerlaatste.
Knippen we er even uit.
Ja, knippen we er even uit. Oké. To conclude my lecture. Ik zal even dit opnieuw doen. To conclude my lecture, I have only one last picture to show. Here you see Jannie Schuit-Lemstra on the right and Vella Culture on the left. Two bereaved mothers who lost their child through suicide long ago. Together they have, over a period of many years, supported other parents after a comparable experience. These mothers possess an archive with almost 700 written reports of their conversations with other bereaved parents about their experience with mental health. If a young psychiatrist, a psychologist, and a nurse practitioner would start a combined research project to analyze these reports on the experiences of these parents with mental health professionals, this analysis would certainly bring us valuable input for new educative material for all professionals, also the nurses. I thank you for your attention.